The dust storm swept across the Arizona territory like the wrath of an angry god, transforming the clear afternoon into a hellish landscape of swirling brown chaos. The wind howled with voices that seemed to carry the screams of the damned, picking up sand and debris from the endless expanse of desert and hurling it skyward in a towering column that blotted out the sun. 5 riders materialized from this churning maelstrom like phantoms emerging from nightmare, their faces smeared with ash and red clay, worn serapes cut deliberately short to mimic Apache war dress. They descended upon the 2 freight wagons with the calculated precision of seasoned predators, but every movement spoke of careful orchestration rather than spontaneous violence. The lead wagon groaned under its burden of supplies, destined for settlement scattered along the Verde River, sacks of flour and beans, cases of ammunition, bolts of calico and wool, that would bring civilization's modest comforts to families carving precarious lives from the harsh borderland. The teamster Tom Brennan, a grizzled veteran of countless desert crossings, fought to control his team of 6 mules as they rolled their eyes white with terror at the approaching storm. The second wagon carried a more precious cargo, 11-year-old Alice Reed, her few earthly possessions wrapped carefully in oiled canvas, and a small iron strongbox containing the deed to their homestead, along with her deceased mother's jewelry, the only tangible legacy of a woman who had died the previous winter, coughing crimson life into white handkerchiefs while snow piled against their cabin windows. Alice crouched beneath the canvas cover, her small hands pressed against her ears as if she could somehow shut out the thunder of hoofbeats and the sharp crack of rifle fire that split the air above her head. Each bullet that struck the wooden planks sent splinters flying like deadly rain, and she could taste dust and fear in equal measure as the world she knew disintegrated around her. "Get yourself down, Miss Alice," Tom Brennan shouted over the chaos, his weathered hands wrestling with leather reins as the mules plunged and reared in their traces. "Stay low and pray these devils pass us by." His words were cut short as a rifle bullet caught him high in the shoulder, the impact spinning him halfway around in his seat before a second shot found his heart and silenced him forever. Ben Cartwright, handling the second wagon with the steady competence of 20 years' experience, managed only a strangled cry of warning before bullets stitched across his chest. He toppled from his perch into the alkaline dust of the desert floor, his blood darkening the pale earth in an ever-widening stain. The lead rider, his mount dancing with barely controlled energy, wheeled toward Alice's wagon with his rifle already swinging in a deadly arc toward the canvas where she cowered. His face, beneath its mask of clay and ash, showed the cold efficiency of a professional killer, and his finger found the trigger with the practiced ease of long experience. For one crystalline moment that seemed to stretch toward eternity, death appeared inevitable as the desert sunrise. Then a figure erupted from the dry wash that paralleled the trail, a Chiricahua Apache warrior, moving with lethal grace despite the pronounced limp that marked his left leg. Dasan had weathered 53 harsh winters in this unforgiving country, each brutal season carving fresh lines into his copper-dark skin and adding new scars to his growing collection. The old cavalry wound in his thigh, a painful souvenir from the blood-soaked battleground at Sebeque Creek, had never properly healed, leaving him with a permanent disability that had effectively ended his days as a traditional warrior in the eyes of his people. But if his body bore the marks of past conflicts, his mind remained as sharp and deadly as the finest obsidian blade. Every canyon and hidden spring, every game trail and potential ambush site across hundreds of square miles was mapped with perfect precision in his memory. He knew this land as intimately as a lover knows the curves of a beloved's body, and that knowledge had kept him alive through decades of warfare pursuit and the grinding daily struggle for survival in a hostile world. Dasan reached Alice just as the rider's shot punched through the space where her small head had been positioned a heartbeat before. The bullet buried itself deep in a sack of flour, sending white powder exploding into the storm-darkened air like premature snow. Without hesitation or thought for his own safety, he scooped the terrified child into his arms and sprinted toward a cluster of black basalt boulders that jutted from the prairie like broken teeth in a giant's jaw. His damaged leg sent lightning bolts of agony up his spine with each jarring impact against the hard ground, but he pushed through the pain with the iron determination that had carried him through countless previous ordeals. Behind them, the systematic destruction continued with military efficiency. The false raiders worked with the methodical thoroughness of seasoned professionals, burning what remained of the wagons and systematically scattering supplies across the desert floor to create the perfect illusion of a successful Apache raid. They doused the wooden beds with kerosene from metal cans, and flames caught quickly in the dry wood, sending columns of black smoke rising into the clearing sky like funeral pyres. "Stay small, little one," Dasan whispered in carefully measured English, his accent thick, but his words clear as he pressed Alice against the largest boulder. "Breathe quiet, like sleeping rabbit. These men they hunt with their ears as much as their eyes." Bullets sparked off the black volcanic rock around them, each impact, leaving bright scars on the ancient stone and filling the air with the sharp scent of pulverized rock and hot metal. Alice could feel the warrior's heart beating steadily against her ear, a calm rhythm that somehow managed to slow her own racing pulse even as chaos exploded around them. But Dasan's keen gaze, trained by a lifetime of reading the desert's subtle language, caught details that would have escaped most observers. These men took nothing of real value tools and ammunition that genuine Apache raiders would have prized above gold lay scattered and ignored in the dust. More telling still, one of the attackers cursed fluently in English when his horse shied at a wind-blown piece of canvas, the words carrying clearly across the prairie despite his attempts at concealment. Damn fool horse," the man snarled, forgetting his assumed role in the heat of the moment. "Stand still, or I'll put a bullet between your ears." When their destructive work was completed to apparent satisfaction, the 5 riders mounted their horses and rode hard toward the distant smudge on the horizon that marked Whiskey Bend. No doubt they would spread carefully rehearsed tales of Apache savagery while the bodies of their victims were still warm, and the smoke from burning wagons still rose toward heaven as mute testimony to their crimes. But Dasan possessed the eyes of a born tracker, and in the settling dust he discovered evidence that would prove crucial in the dark days ahead. A horse's hoofprint pressed deep into the soft earth beside the trail revealed the distinctive pattern of copper nails, the kind used exclusively at Caleb Voss's Copper Gulch mine, where the owner employed a smithy who marked all his work with small copper stars that were as individual as a human fingerprint. Nearby, glinting like a golden coin in the late afternoon sunlight, lay a spent cartridge casing still warm to the touch and stamped clearly with the letter V, Voss's personal mark on ammunition supplied exclusively to his private security force. Dasan pocketed both pieces of evidence with the careful precision of a man who understood their potentially life-saving significance in a territory where Apache raids were automatically blamed for every missing cow, broken fence, and unexplained death. As Alice emerged from behind their rocky shelter, like a small ghost in a torn calico dress, her dark hair tangled with prairie grass and bits of sage, she stared at the burning wagons and the crumpled bodies of men who had been alive and joking just hours before. Her young face went pale as winter morning, and her hands trembled like autumn leaves in a cold wind. "Where's Papa?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the crackling flames and the distant rumble of departing hoofbeats. "He promised he'd meet us in town before sunset. He always keeps his promises." Dasan studied her with the careful attention he would give to reading weather signs or tracking wounded prey. Something about this entire attack felt wrong, too carefully planned, too precisely executed for a random raid. Genuine Apache warriors would have taken the horses, the weapons, anything of practical value. These men had come with a different purpose entirely, and their elaborate disguises suggested a conspiracy that reached far beyond simple banditry. "We find answers," he said finally, extending his scarred hand toward her with infinite patience. But first safety for the little rabbit. In my country, we have saying the wise coyote circles the waterhole 3 times before drinking. We must be wise coyotes now. Alice looked from his weathered face to the smoking remains of everything familiar in her young world, then placed her small fingers trustingly in his weathered palm. My mama used to say that God sends angels when we need them most, she said quietly. Maybe you're my angel even if you don't look like the ones in her picture books. Dasan's weathered features softened almost imperceptibly at her words. Angels come in many forms, little one. Your mother, she was wise woman. We go now find safe place to rest while the desert tells us its secrets. Together, they began the long journey toward the distant line of cottonwoods that marked the course of the Ash River, moving slowly but steadily across the trackless desert as shadows lengthened and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. The abandoned trapper's cabin nestled in a grove of cottonwoods beside the Ash River, like a forgotten memory of more prosperous times. The structure had been built 20 years earlier by a French-Canadian named Pierre Dubois, who had spent 3 profitable seasons taking beaver from the streams that fed into the larger waterway. When the fur trade finally died its inevitable death, Pierre had moved on to seek his fortune in the California goldfields, leaving behind only this single room with its log walls weathered to silver gray by decades of brutal seasons. Working with quiet efficiency, Dasan wedged a rusted shovel blade against the door, an old trapper's trick that would provide warning if anyone attempted unwelcome entry, and built a small fire in the stone hearth using dry wood he had cached there years before. The chimney drew well despite its age, sending smoke up and away from the cabin to disperse harmlessly among the cottonwood branches where it would be nearly impossible to spot from any distance. Alice sat with her knees drawn up to her chest, watching his every movement with eyes that held far too much knowledge for her 11 years. She had not spoken much since asking about her father, and Dasan could see the shock settling over her like a heavy winter blanket. Tell me about your papa, Dasan said gently as he positioned her where she could not be seen from outside. What kind of man is he? What does he do that brings him joy? Alice's face brightened slightly at the invitation to share memories of happier times. He's the best freight hauler in the territory, she said with obvious pride. He knows every trail from here to Prescott, and he can fix anything that breaks. When Mama got sick last winter, he sat by her bed every night and read to her from the Bible. He has this special whistle, 3 notes, like a meadow lark, that he uses to let me know he's coming home safe. She hummed the simple melody, and Dasan committed it to memory, sensing it would be important later. He sounds like good father. Strong man, but gentle heart. He taught me to read before I was 5. Alice continued, warming to the subject. Said education was the one thing nobody could ever take away from a person. And he always said that different people might look different on the outside, but inside we all bleed the same red blood and love the same God. Dasan nodded approvingly. Your father, he has wisdom. In my people's way, we say that a man's worth is measured not by the color of his skin or the language he speaks, but by how he treats those who cannot fight back. A true warrior protects the weak, feeds, the hungry speaks truth, even when lies would be easier. As purple dusk painted the western sky in shades of lavender and gold, Alice moved closer to where Dasan sat, with his back against the weathered log wall. She reached out with the tentative gesture of a wild creature approaching a potential source of comfort, her small fingers tracing the intricate beadwork that decorated his buckskin sleeve. Those patterns, she said softly, they're beautiful. Do they mean something special? Each pattern tells story. Dasan replied, pleased by her genuine interest. This one here, it shows the hunt where I killed my first deer. I was 14 winters old, very proud, very hungry. But my grandmother, she taught me to thank the deer's spirit for giving its life so our family could eat. She said every life, even smallest ant, has purpose and meaning. Alice studied the beadwork more closely, Were you scared? When you killed the deer? I mean, yes, Dasan admitted without shame. To take life even for food is a serious thing. Should always be difficult choice. Only men who kill easily without thought or feeling these are dangerous men. They have lost part of their souls. The conversation was interrupted by the distant sound of hoofbeats on hard ground. Dasan immediately tensed his hand, moving to his rifle, as he peered through a gap in the shuttered window. 3 riders were approaching along the river trail, moving with the systematic patterns of a search party rather than casual travelers. "Stay very still," he whispered to Alice, "like we practiced sleeping rabbit." The riders circled the cabin twice before approaching directly, and Dasan could hear them discussing their search in low voices. Their leader, a man with a voice like gravel scraped across stone, seemed to be following some kind of predetermined plan. "Boss wants them found tonight," the gravelly voice said. "The Apache and the girl both. Can't have witnesses running around loose, not with what they might have seen." "What if they've already made it to town?" asked a second voice, younger and more nervous. "Could be talking to the law right now. Then we'll deal with that problem when we come to it." The leader replied coldly. "But more likely they're holed up somewhere nearby. Wounded Indian with a white child, they can't travel fast or far. We keep looking until we find them." After what seemed like hours, but was probably only minutes, the search party moved on, and their voices fading into the distance as they continued downstream. Dasan waited another full hour before allowing himself to relax slightly, but he maintained his vigilant watch through the long night ahead. "Can I sleep here?" Alice whispered when her eyelids finally grew too heavy to keep open. "Sleep, little rabbit." Dasan nodded, his weathered features softening with something approaching paternal tenderness. "I watch over you. No harm will come while I draw breath." Alice curled up beside him with the instinctive trust of a wounded animal seeking warmth and protection from something infinitely stronger than itself. As her breathing deepened into the natural patterns of exhausted sleep, Dasan began planning their next moves with the methodical precision of a military commander preparing for a crucial campaign. Dawn brought the acrid smell of distant smoke and the unwelcome sound of multiple riders approaching from different directions. Dasan woke Alice with a gentle touch, his finger pressed to his lips in the universal gesture for silence. Through the cabin's single window, he could see armed men spreading out through the cottonwood grove in a coordinated sweep pattern that spoke of military training or extensive experience in manhunting. "Time to go, little one," he whispered. "We use the river trail stay low move like morning mist." They slipped out through the cabin's back window just as the search party reached the front door. The sound of splintering wood told Dasan that his improvised warning system had been discovered, but by then they were already moving through dense willow thickets toward the water's edge, using the natural terrain to mask their movements from pursuing eyes. The Ash River ran low and brown between its banks, winding through dense stands of willow and cottonwood that provided precious cover in an otherwise naked and exposed landscape. Following ancient deer paths that paralleled the life-giving waterway, Dasan led Alice along routes worn smooth by countless generations of animals seeking the moisture essential for survival in this harsh environment. "Where are we going?" Alice whispered as they paused to rest in the shade of an overhanging boulder. "To find honest lawmen." Dasan replied, scanning the surrounding terrain with the practiced eye of a hunted man. "Not all white men serve corrupt masters. There is Deputy in Whiskey Bend Bell is his name, who has reputation for fairness and courage. If any man will listen to truth, it is him." But how do you know he's honest?" Alice asked, displaying the natural skepticism of someone whose world had been shattered by betrayal and violence. Dasan considered the question carefully before answering. 2 winters past this bell, he found Apache children lost in blizzard. He could have left them to die, many would have. but instead he brought them to mission school, made sure they were fed and warm. When other men said he was fool for helping savage children, he answered that all children deserve protection. Such men, he has good heart. They continued their careful journey along the river, pausing frequently to listen for sounds of pursuit and using natural concealment to avoid detection by the systematic search parties that seemed to be covering every square mile of territory between the cabin and Whiskey Bend. Alice proved surprisingly resilient for such a young child, never complaining about the difficult terrain or the constant tension, accepting hardship with the stoic patience of someone who had already endured more tragedy than most adults would face in a lifetime. When they reached the ferry crossing at Devil's Bend, Dasan immediately spotted trouble waiting like a coiled rattlesnake in the morning sun. Two men wearing the rough clothing of freight handlers lounged near the ferry landing with studied casualness, but their horses bore the same distinctive copper-starred shoes he had been tracking since the attack. Their apparently relaxed postures fooled no one who understood the subtle language of professional violence. They were positioned to command the entire landing area, and their hands rested near their weapons with the practiced ease of men who killed for money. Old Pete Hawkins, the ferry operator, stood beside his winch mechanism with the careful stillness of a man who sensed mortal danger, but lacked the power to act against it. Pete had operated this crossing for more than a decade, ferrying everyone from cavalry patrols to traveling merchants, and his experienced eye could distinguish between legitimate travelers and trouble actively seeking a place to manifest itself. But Deputy Amos Bell stepped deliberately from behind the ferry, shed his badge catching and reflecting the morning sunlight like a five-pointed star pinned to his vest. Bell was perhaps 30 years old, with the lean, wiry build of a man who had learned to survive primarily on his intelligence and quick reflexes, rather than brute physical strength. For months, he had been quietly observing Caleb Voss's increasingly suspicious business operations, harboring growing suspicions about corruption, but lacking the concrete evidence necessary to act effectively against the mine boss's expanding influence throughout Whiskey Bend. "I'm looking for an Apache traveling with a white girl." Bell announced, his hand resting on his gun butt, but not yet drawing the weapon. "There's been reports of trouble, and I need to sort out the truth from the lies." One of the fake freight handlers shifted nervously, his eyes darting between Bell's badge and the rifle leaning against a nearby post. "Ain't seen no Indians today, Deputy. Just honest folks trying to make a living." But Dasan chose this moment to emerge from the willows, Alice close beside him, trusting that Bell's reputation for fairness was accurate. The deputy's eyes widened slightly as he took in the Apache's obvious injuries and the child's torn dress, but his expression remained professionally neutral. "You'd be Dasan," Bell said, his voice carefully controlled. "I've heard your name spoken with respect by good people. What happened to you and the child?" The question was clearly aimed at Dasan, rather than the gunman, and the Apache warrior recognized both an opportunity and a test. "False raiders attacked freight wagons," he said, simply producing the copper-nailed horseshoe from his possessions. "They wore Apache dress but spoke English. They left this behind." Bell examined the horseshoe with growing interest, his trained eye immediately recognizing the distinctive craftsmanship. "This came from Voss's mine," he said quietly. "I'd stake my badge on it. One of the fake freight handlers made the fatal mistake of going for his gun when he realized the conversation was not proceeding according to plan. But Pete Hawkins, despite his advanced age, still possessed the quick reflexes of a man who had survived decades on the frontier. The old ferryman grabbed an iron pry bar and brought it down on the gunman's wrist with bone-crushing force, sending the weapon spinning away into the muddy water. The second gunman managed to clear his holster before Bell's bullet took him in the shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him to his knees beside the ferry platform. The wounded man clutched his arm and stared with shock and growing fear at the spreading crimson stain on his shirt. "Now then," Bell said with grim satisfaction, keeping his smoking pistol trained on both wounded men. "Suppose you tell me who's paying your wages and what really happened to those freight wagons. Under the combined pressure of Bell's authority and Pete's intimidating pry bar, the story gradually emerged like water forced from a squeezed sponge. Caleb Voss had been orchestrating fake Apache raids for months, using his private army of gunmen to drive homesteaders off valuable land that he then claimed through legal manipulation and political corruption. The Reed wagons had been targeted specifically because their route passed through territory that contained valuable water rights, and Alice's small family represented an obstacle to Voss's expanding empire of stolen property. "What about her father?" Bell asked, nodding toward Alice. "Where's you and Reed in all this?" The wounded gunman's face went pale beneath his weathered tan. "Boss said Reed was supposed to be away in Prescott," he stammered. "Wasn't supposed to be anywhere near the wagons when we hit them. But then everything went wrong, and now the boss wants all loose ends tied up permanent-like." Alice grabbed Hassan's arm with both hands, her eyes wide with sudden understanding. "Papa wasn't in Prescott," she whispered. "He was supposed to meet us in town, but he never came. What if something happened to him too?" Bell holstered his weapon and knelt down to Alice's eye level, his voice gentle but honest. "We're going to find your father, child, and we're going to put a stop to whatever Voss has been planning. But I need you to be brave a little longer, and I need you both to trust me." The journey to Whiskey Bend required careful planning and constant vigilance, as Voss's network of informants and hired guns extended throughout the surrounding territory, like a spider's web designed to catch anyone who might threaten his carefully constructed criminal empire. Bell knew every back trail and hidden canyon between the ferry crossing and town, and he used this knowledge to guide them along routes that avoided the main roads where ambushes would be easiest to arrange. They traveled mostly at night, resting during the heat of the day in whatever natural shelter they could find among the broken hills and scattered rock formations that dotted the landscape like the remains of some ancient giant's castle. Alice proved remarkably adaptable to the difficult conditions, accepting hardship with the uncomplaining courage of someone who understood that her very survival depended on the wisdom and skill of her protectors. During one of their rest stops in a shallow cave that provided both concealment and protection from the blazing afternoon sun, Alice asked Hassan about his family, his people, and the life he had known before the white man's wars changed everything forever. "I had wife once," Hassan said quietly, his eyes focused on distant memories that brought both joy and sadness. "She was called Dawn Light on Water because her laugh sounded like stream running over stones in early morning. We had son together, strong boy who would have grown to be fine warrior." "What happened to them?" Alice asked with the innocent directness of youth. "Cavalry attack on winter camp." Hassan replied simply, "I was away hunting, came back to find only ashes and graves. That was when I learned that being warrior means more than fighting enemies. Sometimes it means learning to live with pain that never goes away, learning to find new purpose when old purpose is destroyed." Alice moved closer to him, offering the wordless comfort of physical presence. "Is that why you saved me? Because you couldn't save your own family?" Hassan considered the question with the careful thought it deserved. "Perhaps. But also because it was right thing to do. In my people's way, we believe that every act of kindness honors those who have gone before us. When I protect you, I honor Dawn Light on Water and our son. Their spirits live on through good deeds done in their memory." Bell, who had been maintaining watch from the cave mouth, turned back toward them with a troubled expression. "I hate to interrupt," he said quietly, "but we've got riders approaching from 3 different directions. Looks like Voss's men have figured out our general location." The next few hours tested all their skills at concealment and evasion, as armed search parties combed through the hills with increasing desperation. Bell's knowledge of local terrain proved invaluable, guiding them through hidden passes and forgotten mine shafts that provided temporary sanctuary from their relentless pursuers. But it became increasingly clear that they could not continue this deadly game of hide-and-seek indefinitely. "We need to reach Ruth Calder's boarding house," Bell explained as they crouched in the ruins of an old prospector's cabin while hoofbeats thundered past on the trail below. "Ruth's got a good heart and nerves of steel. If anyone in town can keep Alice safe, it's her." "And what about finding the truth about Papa?" Alice asked, her voice small but determined. Bell's expression grew even more serious. "That's going to be the dangerous part," he admitted. "If Voss has done something to your father, then we're not just dealing with land fraud anymore. We're talking about murder, kidnapping, conspiracy crimes that could get a man hanged if we can prove them in court." The boarding house on Elm Street rose 3 full stories against the star-filled sky, its windows glowing with warm yellow light that seemed to promise safety and shelter in a world that had become increasingly dangerous and uncertain. Ruth Calder answered Bell's careful knock within moments, her silver hair hastily pinned back and a shawl thrown over her nightgown. But her eyes were alert and ready for whatever crisis had brought visitors to her door at such an unusual hour. "Amos Bell," she said with evident relief, stepping aside to admit them. "Thank God you're safe. The whole town's been buzzing with wild stories about Apache raids and missing children." Ruth took one comprehensive look at Alice's torn dress and haunted eyes, then immediately began preparing hot water for a bath and laying out clean clothes that would fit the traumatized child. Her movements displayed the practiced efficiency of someone who had dealt with frontier emergencies before, and her voice carried the kind of maternal authority that could calm frightened animals and soothe troubled spirits. "You're completely safe now, dear one," Ruth said as she worked gentle soap through Alice's tangled hair. "No one will hurt you while you're under my protection." Alice began to speak in barely audible whispers about the attack, her father's mysterious absence, and the Apache warrior who had saved her life at the cost of his own safety. Her words painted a picture of violence and betrayal that made Ruth's gentle features harden with righteous anger. These weren't real Apache raiders, Alice said, her voice growing stronger as she felt the security of Ruth's maternal presence. "They spoke English when they thought nobody could hear, and they left behind all the valuable things that real Indians would have taken. Dasan says they were white men disguised to look like savages." Bell, meanwhile, was studying the evidence that Dasan had carefully collected from the attack site: the copper-nailed horseshoe, the cartridge casing stamped with Voss's mark, and fragments of charred documents that suggested a level of planning and organization far beyond what any random band of raiders could have achieved. "This is enough to start asking difficult questions," Bell said grimly. "But it's not enough to arrest a man with Voss's political connections. We need more evidence, and we need witnesses who are willing to testify under oath." Their planning session was interrupted by the arrival of Luis Ortega, the mine foreman who had been secretly observing Bell's investigation for weeks while waiting for the right opportunity to provide assistance. Ortega carried a leather satchel filled with documents that he had been carefully copying from Voss's private files, ledgers showing payments to gunmen rather than miners' correspondence with corrupt officials in the territorial government, and detailed maps marking homesteads that had been targeted for acquisition through various illegal means. "I've got wife and children to think about," Ortega explained as he spread the incriminating documents across Ruth's kitchen table. "But I can't keep silent anymore about what I've seen. Voss isn't just trying to steal land, he's trying to start a war between whites and Apaches that will give him excuse to bring in federal troops and declare martial law throughout the territory." The evidence was damning, but their moment of triumph was short-lived. Sheriff Jim Gaines arrived within the hour with 6 armed deputies, all wearing the hard expressions of men who had been paid to ask no questions and accept no arguments. Their legal authority was backed by forged custody papers claiming that Alice was an abandoned child in need of official protection, and their obvious intention was to remove all witnesses before anyone could present inconvenient evidence to higher authorities. "Nar, I'm here for the girl," Gaines announced with bureaucratic finality. "And for the Apache who kidnapped her from the scene of a legitimate Indian raid." Ruth stepped protectively in front of Alice, her silver hair gleaming in the lamplight and her jaw set with the stubborn determination of someone who had faced tragedy before and learned not to surrender easily to injustice. "That child is under my care, and she stays under my care until proper legal authorities determine otherwise." "I am proper legal authority," Gaines replied coldly, his hand hovering over his holstered weapon. "And I've got papers that say different." Bell examined the custody documents with growing suspicion, noting irregularities in the official seals and recognizing the handwriting as belonging to a clerk who was known to be in Voss's employ. But legal technicalities meant nothing when faced with superior numbers and firepower, and he was forced to watch helplessly as Alice was taken from Ruth's protective embrace and loaded into a closed wagon along with Dasan, whose hands had been bound with heavy chains. "Where are you taking them?" Ruth demanded, her voice carrying across the night air like a battle cry. "Territorial custody hearing in Prescott." Gaines called back as the wagon began to roll away into the darkness. "Due process of law." But Bell's trained ear caught the lie in the sheriff's voice, and his experienced eye noted that the wagon was heading north toward the mining district, rather than south toward the territorial capital. Whatever Voss had planned for his inconvenient witnesses, it would not involve legal proceedings or constitutional protections. The wagon bounced and lurched along the rough mining road for what seemed like hours, carrying Alice and Dasan deeper into the maze of tunnels, processing facilities, and company buildings that comprised Voss's industrial empire. Alice pressed close to Dasan's side, drawing comfort from his steady presence, even as both of them understood that their situation was becoming increasingly desperate with each passing mile. "Are we going to die?" Alice whispered, her voice barely audible above the creaking of wooden wheels and the clatter of iron-shod hooves on rocky ground. "Death comes to all living things eventually," Dasan replied with quiet dignity. "But it has not come for us yet. While we still draw breath, there is always hope for escape, for justice, for truth to triumph over lies." Alice studied his weathered face in the dim light that filtered through the wagon's canvas cover. "You're not afraid, are you?" "Fear is a natural thing," Dasan said honestly. "Even warriors know fear. But courage is not absence of fear. Courage is doing what must be done despite fear. Your mother and father, they raised you to be courageous. Now is time to prove they taught you well." Their destination proved to be the Copper Gulch mine itself, a sprawling complex of shafts, tunnels, and processing equipment that had been carved into the living rock of the desert mountains like a great wound in the earth's flesh. Gas-powered generators provided electric lighting for the main facilities, but most of the underground workings remained illuminated only by kerosene lamps and candles that cast dancing shadows on rough-hewn walls. They were separated upon arrival, with Alice being taken to a small office building, while Dasan disappeared into the labyrinthine tunnel system, where inconvenient prisoners could vanish forever without leaving any trace of their fate. The office where Alice found herself confined was spartanly furnished, but comfortable enough, with a desk, several chairs, and windows that had been boarded up from the outside to prevent any possibility of escape or communication with the outside world. To her amazement and joy, she discovered that she was not alone in her captivity. Ewan Reed sat slumped in one corner of the room, his clothes torn and dirty, his face bearing the marks of rough treatment, but his eyes lighting up with tremendous relief when he saw his daughter alive and apparently unharmed. "Alice," he cried, gathering her into his arms with desperate intensity. "Dear God, I thought you were dead. When I heard about the attack on the wagons, I feared the worst. But even as they embraced, Alice sensed something wrong in her father's manner, a guilt and shame that seemed to weigh him down. Like physical chains, his eyes would not meet hers directly, and his voice carried undertones of self-loathing that she had never heard before. "Papa," she said carefully, "what are you doing here? How did Voss's men capture you?" Ewan's face crumpled with the weight of terrible knowledge. "They didn't capture me, Alice," he whispered. "I came here willingly. I made a deal with Voss, and now I realize what a fool I've been." The story emerged in painful fragments as Ewan struggled to find words for his shameful actions. After his wife's death and the mounting debts from her medical care, Voss had approached him with what seemed like a reasonable business proposition: stage a fake Apache raid on his own freight wagons, collect insurance money, and share the profits while helping to create justification for increased military presence in the territory. "I thought it would be easy money," Ewan said, his voice hollow with self-recrimination. "Just burn some empty wagons, claim they were attacked by Indians, collect the insurance payment. Voss assured me you would be safely in town with Ruth when it happened, that no one would be hurt." Alice stared at her father with growing horror as the implications of his confession sank in. "You mean you helped plan the attack? You knew those men were going to burn our wagons, but not hurt anyone?" Ewan insisted desperately. "Voss promised me no one would be harmed. The Teamsters were supposed to be warned in advance, given time to escape safely. You were supposed to be staying with Ruth in town completely out of danger. But then Voss changed the plan at the last minute, said there couldn't be any witnesses, no loose ends." The terrible truth was like a knife twisting in Alice's heart. Her own father had participated in the conspiracy that led to the deaths of Tom Brennan and Ben Cartwright, men who had been loyal employees and trusted friends. The attack that had traumatized her and nearly cost her life had been orchestrated partly by the person she trusted most in the world. "How could you?" she whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. "How could you do such a thing?" Ewan reached toward her with trembling hands, but Alice pulled away from his touch as if he had become a stranger. "I was desperate," he pleaded. "After your mother died, the debts were crushing us. The homestead was mortgaged to the hilt, and I couldn't see any way to provide for your future. Voss made it sound so simple, so safe. But people died, Papa, good men who trusted you." "I know," Ewan cried, his voice breaking with anguish. "I know, and I'll have to live with that knowledge for the rest of my life. But I was trying to save something for you, trying to ensure you'd have a future, even if I didn't survive to provide for you." Their reunion was interrupted by the arrival of Caleb Voss himself, a man whose appearance commanded immediate attention and respect, even from those who despised everything he represented. Voss was perhaps 45 years old, tall and strongly built, with iron-gray hair and intelligent eyes that missed nothing of importance in any situation. He dressed in the finest clothes that money could buy, but beneath his civilized exterior lurked something predatory and utterly ruthless. "Miss Reed, Mum," Voss said with elaborate courtesy, removing his hat and bowing slightly in her direction. "I regret that circumstances have brought us together under such unpleasant conditions." Alice found her voice despite her fear and confusion. "You're the one who ordered those men to attack our wagons. You're responsible for Tom and Ben getting killed." Voss's expression didn't change, but something cold and dangerous flickered in his eyes. "I'm responsible for building the largest mining operation in the territory and providing employment for hundreds of hard-working men," he replied smoothly. "Sometimes progress requires difficult decisions, and occasionally there are unfortunate casualties along the way." "Murder isn't progress," Alice said with surprising firmness. "It's evil." "Evil is a matter of perspective, my dear." Voss continued settling himself comfortably in one of the office chairs, as if he were conducting a routine business meeting. I'm creating civilization in a wilderness, bringing order to chaos, establishing the foundation for future prosperity. Your father understood the necessity of difficult choices when he agreed to help me. Ewan tried to interrupt, but Voss silenced him with a gesture. The original plan was quite reasonable. The mine boss continued. Stage a convincing Apache raid, eliminate some unwanted competition for valuable water rights, collect insurance money, and create justification for increased military protection. Everyone benefits, and the only casualties would be some expendable freight wagons. But you changed the plan, Ewan said desperately. You didn't tell me you intended to kill witnesses. Voss shrugged with casual indifference. Plans evolve as circumstances change. Your daughter's unexpected presence complicated matters, and the Apache's interference created additional problems that required prompt resolution. I adapt to changing conditions, that's why I succeed where others fail. Alice felt a chill run down her spine as she realized the full extent of Voss's callous calculation. To him, human lives were simply factors to be manipulated or eliminated as necessary to achieve his goals. The deaths of Tom Brennan and Ben Cartwright meant nothing more to him than the cost of replacing broken equipment. "What are you going to do with us?" she asked, proud that her voice remained steady despite her terror. "Not Kidhor." "That depends entirely on your cooperation," Voss replied. "Your father has already agreed to sign documents transferring ownership of your family's water rights to my company in exchange for a substantial cash settlement. With your signature as well, the transaction becomes legally binding, and everyone benefits from the arrangement. And if we refuse," Voss's smile never wavered, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. "Then I'm afraid you'll both suffer the same fate as that meddlesome Apache who caused so much unnecessary trouble. Mining accidents are unfortunately common in this business, and sometimes entire families perish together in tragic cave-ins or equipment failures. The threat was clear and unambiguous sign: over their property or die." Alice looked at her father and saw that he had already broken under the pressure, his spirit crushed by guilt and the weight of consequences he had never anticipated when he first agreed to Voss's seemingly reasonable proposition. But Alice had been shaped by different experiences, strengthened by her mother's faith and Dasan's teachings about courage in the face of impossible odds. She straightened her shoulders and looked directly into Voss's cold eyes without flinching. "I won't sign anything," she said clearly, "and neither will my father." Voss's expression finally changed, showing the first glimpse of genuine anger beneath his civilized veneer. "I think you'll find that your resolve weakens considerably when you see what happens to people who oppose me." He gestured to one of his guards, who immediately left the room and returned minutes later with news that made Alice's blood run cold. Dasan had been taken deep into the mine's most dangerous sections, where a carefully planned accident would eliminate him without leaving any evidence of murder. The old warrior's fate was sealed unless Alice agreed to cooperate immediately. But even as despair threatened to overwhelm her, Alice heard a sound that made her heart leap with sudden hope. 3 notes drifting across the night air, like a meadowlark's call, the special whistle that meant rescue was coming. The sound came again, closer this time, and Alice realized that Belle and Ruth had somehow tracked them to the mine and were attempting a rescue operation despite the overwhelming odds against success. The whistle was followed by the distant crack of rifle fire and shouts of alarm from Voss's security force, indicating that the battle for justice had finally begun in earnest. Meanwhile, deep in the mine's treacherous tunnel system, Dasan was using his intimate knowledge of underground terrain to turn the tables on his captors. The guards who had been ordered to arrange his accidental death had underestimated both his physical capabilities and his tactical cunning, assuming that his age and injuries would make him helpless in the confined spaces of the mine shafts. But Dasan had spent decades learning to use intelligence and experience to compensate for physical limitations, and the underground environment actually favored his skills over those of younger, stronger opponents who lacked his hard-won understanding of how to fight in darkness and confined spaces. When the first guard bent over to examine what appeared to be an unconscious prisoner, Dasan struck with lightning speed, using pressure points and leverage to render his opponent unconscious without making enough noise to alert other guards. Working with methodical precision, he systematically eliminated the guards one by one using stealth and surprise to overcome superior numbers and firepower. Each victory provided him with additional weapons and equipment, gradually evening the odds as he fought his way back toward the surface and the office building where Alice was being held. The battle above ground had developed into a running firefight between Bell's hastily assembled rescue party and Voss's professional security force. Ruth had rallied every honest citizen in Whiskey Bend who possessed the courage to stand against corruption, while Ortega had convinced several miners to join the fight against their tyrannical employer. The rescue force was outnumbered but highly motivated, fighting with the desperate courage of people who understood that failure meant not just their own deaths, but the triumph of evil over justice. Bell himself led a flanking attack against the main office building, using his knowledge of the facility's layout to approach from an unexpected direction, while Ruth created a diversion by organizing a frontal assault on the mine's main gate. The deputy's tactical skills, honed by years of frontier law enforcement, proved crucial in neutralizing several key defensive positions and opening a path to the building where Alice was imprisoned. Inside the office, Voss had grown increasingly agitated as the sounds of battle drew closer, and his supposedly impregnable position came under coordinated attack. He paced back and forth like a caged predator, barking orders at subordinates who were clearly struggling to maintain control of the deteriorating situation. "Get that girl's signature on those documents," he snarled at Ewan. "Once the transfer is legal, we can eliminate all the witnesses and claim self-defense against Apache raiders and their white accomplices." But Ewan had found his courage at last, inspired by his daughter's moral strength and his growing understanding of the true consequences of his earlier weakness. He stepped protectively in front of Alice, his jaw set with newfound determination. "No more," he said firmly. "I won't let you use my child to legitimize your crimes. I made terrible mistakes, but I won't compound them by sacrificing Alice to save my own skin." Voss drew his revolver with smooth, practiced motion, the weapon's metal barrel gleaming in the lamplight as he aimed it directly at Ewan's chest. "Then you've both chosen to die. So be it." The confrontation was interrupted by the dramatic arrival of Dasan, who burst through the office door with blood streaming from fresh wounds, but his eyes blazing with unquenchable determination. He had fought his way through dozens of guards and hundreds of yards of treacherous tunnel, sustained by his promise to protect Alice, and his understanding that her survival represented hope for justice in a world that seemed increasingly dominated by corruption and violence. "Step away from the child." Dasan commanded, his rifle trained on Voss with rock-steady aim, despite his obvious injuries. Voss spun around to face this unexpected threat, his own weapon swinging in a deadly arc toward the Apache warrior. For one frozen moment that seemed to stretch toward eternity, two irreconcilable forces faced each other across the small room, the embodiment of greed and ruthless ambition, confronting the personification of honor and self-sacrifice. The confrontation was decided by Bell's timely arrival, as the deputy burst through the office's rear window with his badge gleaming and his weapon drawn. Caught between two armed opponents with no chance of escape, Voss finally recognized that his carefully constructed empire was crumbling around him like a house built on shifting sand. "It's finished, Voss," Bell announced with quiet authority. "Your men are surrendering, your operation is exposed, and territorial marshals are already on their way from Prescott with federal warrants for your arrest." But Voss was not the kind of man who accepted defeat gracefully or went quietly into legal custody. With the desperate cunning of a cornered predator, He grabbed Alice and pressed his gun to her head, using her as a human shield while backing toward the room's main exit. Nobody moves, or the girl dies. He snarled his civilized mask, finally slipping to reveal the monster beneath. I've got horses waiting outside, and I'm taking her with me as insurance. Anyone who tries to follow will be responsible for her death. Alice found herself pressed against Voss's chest, feeling his heart hammering with fear and rage, smelling the expensive cologne that couldn't quite mask the stench of moral corruption that seemed to emanate from his very pores. But she remembered Dassan's teachings about courage, her mother's faith in divine justice, and her own growing understanding that some things were worth fighting for, regardless of personal cost. Well, let her go, Voss. Ewan pleaded, his voice breaking with anguish. Take me instead. I'm the one who helped you. I'm the one who deserves punishment. Nobody deserves to die for your crimes. Bell said firmly, his gun trained on Voss, but unable to fire without risking Alice's life. Release the child and surrender peacefully. You still have legal rights, constitutional protections. Voss laughed harshly, the sound filled with bitter contempt for concepts like justice and legal process. Legal rights, constitutional protections I've bought and paid for every judge, sheriff, and territorial official within 200 miles. The law belongs to whoever has enough money to purchase it. But his moment of boastful triumph was interrupted by an unexpected sound, the rumble of heavy machinery approaching from outside, accompanied by the thunder of many hoofbeats and the authoritative voices of federal law enforcement officers who possessed jurisdiction beyond the reach of local corruption. Through the office windows, Alice could see United States Marshals surrounding the mine complex with professional efficiency, their badges reflecting starlight and their weapons ready for immediate action. Behind them rode a full company of cavalry soldiers, their blue uniforms and military bearing indicating that this was no ordinary law enforcement operation, but rather a federal response to crimes that threatened territorial security and national interests. Now, Caleb Voss. A voice boomed through a speaking trumpet. This is United States Marshal John Patterson. You are surrounded by federal officers and ordered to surrender immediately. Release your hostages and submit to lawful arrest. Voss's face went white as he realized that his web of local corruption offered no protection against federal authority backed by military force. The territorial officials he had bribed and intimidated possessed no influence over United States Marshals, who answered directly to Washington and operated under presidential orders. How? He whispered, his voice barely audible above the sounds of approaching law enforcement. Bell smiled grimly. Luis Ortega had friends in the territorial capital who knew how to reach honest officials beyond your influence. When they saw the evidence of your crimes, the forged documents, the payment records, the systematic land fraud, they contacted federal authorities immediately. The final confrontation moved to the mine's main courtyard, where federal marshals had established a defensive perimeter that made escape impossible. Voss still held Alice as a human shield, but his strategic position was hopeless, and his options were rapidly disappearing like water in desert sand. I want safe passage to the Mexican border, he shouted at Marshal Patterson. The girl comes with me as insurance. Any attempt to stop me results in her death. Patterson was a veteran law enforcement officer who had dealt with desperate criminals in situations like this before. He understood the delicate balance between firmness and negotiation that such circumstances required, and his voice carried absolute authority when he responded. No deals, Voss. No negotiations. Release the child immediately and surrender or face the consequences of your continued defiance of federal law. The standoff might have continued indefinitely, but Alice herself provided the decisive element that broke the stalemate. Drawing upon reserves of courage she had never known she possessed, inspired by everything Dassan had taught her about facing fear with determination, She suddenly threw her full weight to one side, while driving her elbow backward into Voss's solar plexus, with all the force her small body could generate. The unexpected attack caught Voss completely off guard, breaking his grip and sending him staggering backward as Alice rolled away to safety. In that crucial instant, when the mine boss was off balance and unable to aim accurately, Dason fired the shot that ended Caleb Voss's reign of terror forever, his bullet finding its target with the precision that had made him a feared warrior in his younger days. The aftermath of the battle brought both justice and healing to the survivors of Voss's criminal conspiracy. Federal investigators uncovered evidence of systematic corruption that reached into the highest levels of territorial government, resulting in arrests, trials, and reforms that helped restore public faith in legal institutions. The stolen lands were returned to their rightful owners, and the victims of Voss's violence received compensation from his seized assets. Ewan Reed faced legal consequences for his participation in the conspiracy. But his cooperation with federal investigators and his obvious remorse led to a sentence of community service rather than imprisonment. He dedicated the remainder of his life to making amends for his mistakes, working tirelessly to help other families who had been victimized by land fraud and mining company abuses. Alice's inheritance was secured through proper legal channels, ensuring that her mother's sacrifice and her family's struggles would not be forgotten or rendered meaningless. But more importantly, she had gained a new family in the form of Dawson and Ruth, who provided the love, guidance, and stability that every child deserves. Ruth expanded her boarding house into a school and clinic that served the entire community, funded partly by Alice's inheritance and partly by donations from grateful citizens who had been freed from Voss's tyranny. The institution became a beacon of hope for orphaned children, injured miners, and anyone else who needed sanctuary from the harsh realities of frontier life. Dawson, despite his physical limitations, found new purpose as a teacher and guide who helped bridge the gap between white and Apache cultures. His wisdom, courage, and infinite patience made him beloved by children of all backgrounds, and his stories of traditional Apache life helped preserve important cultural knowledge for future generations. On a warm evening 6 months after the battle at Copper Gulch, Alice and Dawson sat beside the rebuilt cabin on the Ash River, watching the sunset paint the desert sky in brilliant shades of gold and crimson. The old warrior was teaching her to carve traditional Apache patterns in soft pine wood, his weathered hands guiding her smaller ones with infinite patience. "Tell me again about your wife," Alice said softly as she worked on a particularly intricate design. "About dawn light on water and your son." Dawson smiled, his eyes focused on memories that no longer brought only pain, but also joy in their remembrance. "They would have liked you very much, little rabbit. Dawn Light on Water always said that courage comes in many forms, and she would have been proud to see how brave you were when it mattered most. Do you think they're watching over us from the spirit world?" "I know they are," Dawson replied with quiet certainty. "Just as your mother watches over you, just as all those who love us continue to guide our steps, even after they have walked on to the next life. Love is stronger than death, little one. It endures forever." Alice looked up from her carving to study the weathered face of the man who had become her protector, teacher, and beloved friend. "Can I sleep here tonight?" she asked, using the ritual words that had become their private signal for safety and belonging. Dawson's features softened with the paternal tenderness that had grown stronger with each passing day. "You already are sleeping here, little rabbit," he replied, using the response that had become his promise of permanent protection and unconditional love. "This is your home now for as long as you want it to be." As darkness settled over the desert and the first stars appeared in the vast sky above, two souls who had found each other in the midst of violence and tragedy settled down to rest in the peace they had fought so hard to achieve. Justice had been served. Truth had triumphed over deception, and love had proven stronger than hatred. In the distance, a coyote called to its mate across the desert's silence. And somewhere in the darkness, an owl hooted softly as it began its nightly hunt. but inside the cabin, surrounded by the comforting sounds of a world at peace. Alice slept without fear for the first time since that terrible day when dust storms and false raiders had shattered her childhood innocence. She dreamed of her mother's gentle voice, singing lullabies, of her father's whistled melody, carried on desert winds, and of all the tomorrows that stretched ahead, like an unwritten story waiting to be filled with hope, healing, and the quiet joy of a family built not by blood alone, but by choice, sacrifice, and the unbreakable bonds of mutual love and protection. The desert wind whispered through the cottonwood leaves with the sound of ancient wisdom, carrying promises of new beginnings and the eternal truth that light will always triumph over darkness for those who possess the courage to keep fighting for what is right, no matter how impossible the odds may seem. The seasons turned as they always had in the Arizona territory, but now they brought healing rather than hardship to those who had survived Caleb Voss's reign of terror. Spring arrived with unexpected gentleness, painting the desert floor with wildflowers that had waited years for the right combination of rainfall and hope to finally bloom. The Ash River ran clearer than it had in decades, no longer polluted by the runoff from Voss's mining operations, and fish returned to pools that had been barren for far too long. Alice grew taller and stronger with each passing month. But more importantly, she learned to smile again, without the shadow of fear that had haunted her eyes since that terrible day when her world first collapsed. Under Dasan's patient guidance, she mastered not only traditional Apache crafts, but also the deeper wisdom of understanding how all living things were connected in the great web of existence that bound the earth together. Every creature has its place and purpose. Dasan explained one morning as they watched a family of deer drinking from the river's edge. The deer feeds the wolf keeps the deer herd strong, and both serve the land by bringing life and death in their proper seasons. Even we humans, for all our pride and cleverness, are part of this same pattern. Alice nodded thoughtfully, her young mind working to grasp concepts that many adults never learned. Is that why you saved me? Because it was your proper place in the pattern? Perhaps, Dasan said with a gentle smile that had become as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. Or perhaps the pattern saved us both by bringing us together when we needed each other most. Sometimes the greatest gifts come disguised as the worst tragedies. Ruth's boarding house had indeed become a beacon of hope for the entire community. But it was Alice's presence that truly transformed the institution from a mere business into something approaching a miracle. The traumatized child who had once cowered in terror at unexpected sounds now moved through the halls with quiet confidence, offering comfort to other young victims of violence and loss, sharing the hard-won wisdom that only those who have faced the worst and survived can truly understand. She became particularly close to a young Apache boy named Running Fox, whose family had been killed in a genuine cavalry raid several months before Alice's rescue. The boy spoke no English. When he arrived at Ruth's establishment, communicated only through gestures and the occasional word in his native tongue, and seemed to trust no one until Alice began sitting with him during his nightmares and sharing her own memories of terror overcome. He reminds me of myself when Dasan first found me, Alice confided to Ruth one evening as they watched the boy help with kitchen chores. So scared and angry and convinced that the whole world was against him. "And what changed your mind?" Ruth asked, though she already knew the answer. "Someone showed me that not everyone wanted to hurt me," Alice replied simply. "Someone proved that there were still good people in the world who would risk everything to protect a frightened child. Now I want to be that person for him." The transformation was gradual, but unmistakable. Running Fox began to speak hesitant English words, started participating in group activities, and eventually began to smile at Alice's gentle jokes and patient encouragement. But the real breakthrough came when he witnessed Alice having one of her own nightmares, a rare occurrence now, but still occasionally triggered by unexpected loud noises or the sight of men on horseback approaching the boarding house. Instead of being frightened by Alice's momentary return to terror, Running Fox sat beside her bed and began singing a traditional Apache lullaby in his clear young voice, offering the same kind of wordless comfort that had been given to him during his darkest hours. It was a moment that brought tears to Ruth's eyes and confirmed her growing belief that healing was not just possible, but inevitable, when love and patience were given time to work their quiet miracles. Ewan Reed's journey toward redemption proved more difficult than his daughter's path to healing, but it was no less remarkable in its own way. The guilt and shame that had driven him to participate in Voss's conspiracy continued to torment him even after justice had been served and legal consequences had been faced. He threw himself into his community service with the desperate energy of a man trying to atone for sins that seemed too large for any earthly penance. Working alongside other men who had been deceived by Voss's promises or coerced into participation through threats against their families, Ewan helped rebuild homes that had been destroyed in fake raids, restored water rights that had been stolen through legal manipulation, and provided testimony that helped federal investigators trace the full extent of the corruption that had infected territorial government. But his most important work was much quieter and more personal, on the slow, patient process of rebuilding his relationship with Alice and learning to forgive himself for the choices that had nearly cost them both everything they held dear. The conversations were often difficult, sometimes painful, but they were also necessary for both father and daughter to move forward into whatever future awaited them. "I keep wondering what your mother would think of what I did," Ewan said one afternoon as he and Alice walked along the river path where they had once planned to build a larger cabin. She always believed that people were fundamentally good, that even the worst circumstances couldn't destroy the basic decency in human nature. I'm afraid I proved her wrong. Alice considered his words carefully before responding, drawing upon wisdom that seemed far beyond her years. "Mama also believed in forgiveness," she said quietly. "She used to tell me that God's love was big enough to cover even the worst mistakes, as long as people were truly sorry and willing to change. Are you truly sorry, Papa? More than you can possibly imagine." Ewan replied, his voice thick with emotion. "Then Mama would forgive you," Alice said with quiet certainty. "And if God can forgive you and Mama can forgive you, maybe it's time you learn to forgive yourself." The wisdom of a child who had faced the worst and chosen to embrace hope rather than bitterness helped Ewan begin the long journey toward self-acceptance and inner peace. It would take years to fully heal the wounds that guilt and shame had carved into his soul. But the process had finally begun. Deputy Bell recovered from his injuries sustained during the rescue operation, though he would always carry scars from the bullets that had nearly ended his life in service to justice. His courage during the investigation and his willingness to risk everything to protect innocent victims made him a hero throughout the territory. But he wore his newfound fame with characteristic humility. Just did what any decent man would do. He insisted whenever someone praised his actions. The real heroes were Dasan and Alice. They're the ones who refused to give up hope even when everything seemed hopeless. Bell's reputation for integrity and competence led to offers of positions with federal law enforcement agencies, but he chose to remain in Whiskey Bend as the town's marshal, determined to ensure that corruption could never again take root in his community. He instituted new procedures for investigating suspicious deaths, established better communication with territorial authorities, and created a citizen oversight committee that helped keep local government honest and accountable. More personally, he found himself spending increasing amounts of time at Ruth's boarding house, not just in his official capacity, but as a friend and frequent dinner guest who seemed to find excuses to extend his visits well into the evening hours. Ruth, for her part, began taking special care with her appearance on days when she expected his visits, and their conversations grew longer and more intimate as the months passed. "I think Deputy Bell is sweet on Miss Ruth," Alice confided to Dasan one evening as they watched the lawman help Ruth carry supplies into the boarding house. "And what do you think of such things?" Dasan asked with barely concealed amusement. "I think Ruth deserves to be happy," Alice replied seriously. "She's given so much love to all of us children. She should have someone to love her back in the way that grown-ups love each other." The romance between Belle and Ruth developed with the careful patience of two mature people who had both experienced loss and understood the precious nature of second chances. Their courtship was conducted with Victorian propriety but genuine warmth, and it became a source of joy and hope for everyone who witnessed their growing affection. Luis Ortega returned to mining work, but now as the foreman of a worker-owned cooperative that operated several of the smaller claims that had been liberated from Voss's monopoly. The new arrangement provided better wages, safer working conditions, and a share of profits for every man who contributed his labor to the dangerous work of extracting precious metals from the unforgiving earth. "It's what mining should have been from the beginning," Ortega explained to a territorial newspaper reporter who came to write about the cooperative's success. Men working together for mutual benefit, sharing both risks and rewards, treating each other with the dignity that every human being deserves. The cooperative's success inspired similar arrangements throughout the territory, and Ortega found himself traveling from camp to camp, helping other workers organize and negotiate with mine owners who had previously held absolute power over their employees' lives and livelihoods. It was dangerous work. Several mine bosses attempted to have him killed or driven away. But Ortega persevered with the quiet courage of a man who had seen what justice could accomplish when good people refused to accept injustice. As autumn arrived with its promise of cooler weather and the harvest season that would determine whether communities prospered or struggled through the coming winter, Alice and Dasan began making plans for a special journey that would mark an important milestone in their relationship and her personal growth. "I want to visit your people," Alice announced one evening as they sat by the river watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant shades of gold and crimson. "I want to learn more about Apache ways, and I want them to know that not all white people are their enemies." Dasan studied her face carefully, seeing not just the courage that had sustained her through so many trials, but also the wisdom and compassion that made her a bridge between two worlds that had been at war for far too long. "It will not be an easy journey," he warned. "My people have suffered greatly at hands of white soldiers and settlers. Many will not trust you, no matter how pure your intentions. But you'll be with me," Alice said with simple faith. "And if they trust you, maybe they'll learn to trust me too." The journey to the Apache reservation took them through some of the most beautiful and treacherous country in the Arizona territory, following ancient trails that had been worn smooth by countless generations of native feet and hooves. They traveled slowly, partly because of Dasan's physical limitations, but mostly because Alice wanted to absorb every detail of the landscape that had shaped the people she was coming to love and understand. Dasan proved to be an excellent teacher, pointing out medicinal plants that could heal wounds or ease pain, showing her how to read weather signs in cloud formations and wind patterns, explaining the complex relationships between different animal species and their environments. Each lesson was more than just practical knowledge. It was part of a worldview that saw all life as sacred and interconnected. "White man's way is to own the land," Dasan explained as they paused to rest beside a natural spring that had provided water for travelers for thousands of years. "Apache way is to belong to the land. We are not its masters, but its children, and children must learn to live in harmony with their mother." Alice nodded thoughtfully, beginning to understand how different philosophies about humanity's relationship to nature had contributed to the conflicts between whites and Indians. "Maybe that's why there's been so much war," she said. "People who think differently about such important things are bound to have trouble understanding each other. Understanding is first step toward peace." Dasan agreed. "But understanding must come from both sides. and it must be built on respect for differences rather than desire to eliminate them. The Apache reservation was not what Alice had expected. Instead of the primitive squalor that newspapers often described, she found a community of people who maintained their dignity and cultural traditions despite the harsh restrictions imposed by government authorities. Children played traditional games, elders told ancient stories, and families worked together to create beautiful handicrafts that expressed artistic sensibilities developed over centuries of careful observation and patient craftsmanship. But she also saw the poverty, the inadequate government rations, the constant presence of military guards who treated the reservation's inhabitants more like prisoners than fellow human beings. The contrast between the people's inherent nobility and their forced circumstances filled Alice with a righteous anger that reminded Dasan of his own younger self. Why don't they fight back? Alice asked one evening as they sat around a small fire with several Apache families who had welcomed them despite their initial suspicions. An elderly woman named Singing Bird answered in fluent English, her voice carrying the weight of accumulated sorrows and hard-won wisdom. "We fought for many years, child. We lost friends, family members, entire ways of life in that fighting. Now we fight in a different way. By surviving, by keeping our stories alive, by teaching our children who they are, despite what others tell them they should become." Alice spent hours listening to Singing Bird's stories about Apache history, learning about heroes and villains, victories and defeats, the complex relationships between different tribal groups, and their interactions with Spanish colonists, Mexican settlers, and American pioneers. The stories painted a picture of a people who had adapted to countless changes while maintaining their essential identity. And Alice began to understand that survival itself could be a form of resistance. "Your granddaughter has good heart," Singing Bird told Dasan in Apache, not knowing that Alice had been learning the language during their journey and could understand much of what was said. "She is not my granddaughter by blood," Dasan replied in the same language, "but she is family by choice, which is sometimes stronger bond than blood." Alice felt tears spring to her eyes at his words, understanding that she had finally found the sense of belonging that had been missing since her mother's death. She was not Apache by birth, but she had been adopted into their ways of seeing the world, and that adoption was complete and unconditional. The return journey to Whiskey Bend took them through different country, following trails that Dasan had not traveled for many years, but that remained clearly marked in his phenomenal memory. They encountered other travelers along the way: prospectors, traders, military patrols, families seeking new opportunities in the expanding frontier. And Alice was struck by how differently people reacted to her and Dasan when they traveled together. Some saw only an Apache warrior with a white captive and prepared for trouble before realizing their mistake. Others recognized the genuine affection between them and responded with curiosity rather than hostility. A few seemed to understand instinctively that they were witnessing something rare and precious, a friendship that transcended racial boundaries and cultural differences. "People don't know what to make of us," Alice observed after a particularly awkward encounter with a freight wagon crew who couldn't seem to decide whether to rescue her or arrest Dasan. "Change is always confusing for those who have never seen it before," Dasan replied philosophically. "But confusion is better than hatred. Confused people can learn new ways of thinking. Hateful people have closed their minds to new possibilities." By the time they reached Ruth's boarding house, Alice had grown noticeably in both physical stature and emotional maturity. The journey had completed a transformation that had begun with the attack on the freight wagons, turning a traumatized child into a young woman who possessed unusual wisdom about the complexities of human nature and intercultural relationships. Ruth greeted them with tears of joy and relief, having worried constantly about their safety during the weeks they had been away. But she immediately noticed the change in Alice, the new confidence and serenity that marked someone who had found her place in the world and was comfortable with her identity. "You look different." Ruth said as she examined Alice with the caring eye of a surrogate mother. Older somehow, more sure of yourself. I know who I am now, Alice replied simply. I'm not just a white girl or just someone who learned Apache ways. I'm both, and that makes me something new, someone who can understand both worlds because I belong to both of them. The autumn months brought preparations for what everyone hoped would be a peaceful winter. The first in years not overshadowed by fear of mysterious raids or corrupt officials. The community that had emerged from Voss's defeated conspiracy was stronger and more united than anyone had dared to hope, bound together by shared struggle and mutual support. Belle and Ruth announced their engagement at a harvest celebration that brought together people from throughout the territory. Ranchers and miners, shopkeepers, and lawmen Apache families from the reservation, and Mexican vaqueros from across the border. The diverse crowd that gathered to celebrate their happiness would have been impossible to imagine during Voss's reign of terror, when fear and suspicion had kept different groups apart. Alice served as Ruth's maid of honor at the wedding ceremony, which took place in the boarding house's main parlor on a crisp December morning, when the air was clear enough to see mountains 50 miles away. Dasan walked her down the aisle in place of her absent father, who was serving his community service sentence in Prescott, but sent his blessing along with a carefully carved jewelry box that he had made during his spare time. The ceremony itself was simple, but deeply moving, conducted by a Methodist minister who had traveled from Tucson specifically to unite two people whose love story had become legendary throughout the territory. Belle's vows spoke of Ruth's courage and compassion, while Ruth promised to stand beside him in his continuing efforts to ensure that justice prevailed over corruption. I've never seen two people more perfectly matched, Alice whispered to Dasan as they watched the newlyweds share their first kiss as husband and wife. True love is rare gift. Dasan agreed quietly. It should be treasured and protected like sacred fire that must never be allowed to die. As winter settled over the Arizona territory, with unusual gentleness, bringing just enough snow to please the children, but not enough to create serious hardships, Alice and Dasan established new routines in their cabin by the river. The seasons of crisis and conflict had given way to seasons of growth and healing, and both of them were learning to find joy in simple daily activities that had once seemed impossible luxuries. Alice continued her education under Ruth's guidance, but now her studies included not just traditional academic subjects, but also practical skills like herbal medicine, animal tracking, and the complex art of reading weather patterns that could mean the difference between life and death in country, where nature's moods could change without warning. Dasan, meanwhile, found new purpose in teaching other children, both white and Apache, the survival skills and cultural wisdom that had sustained his people through centuries of challenge and change. His reputation as a teacher and storyteller spread throughout the territory, and families began bringing their children to learn from the old warrior who had proven that wisdom was more valuable than physical strength. You're becoming famous, Alice teased one evening as they prepared their simple supper of cornbread venison stew and the strong coffee that had become Dasan's one concession to white man's dietary habits. Fame is burden I do not seek, Dasan replied with characteristic humility. But if sharing knowledge helps prevent future wars between our peoples, then perhaps burden is worth carrying. Their conversations had evolved far beyond the simple reassurances that had characterized their early relationship. Now they discussed complex philosophical questions about justice and mercy, the nature of courage, the responsibilities that came with survival when others had perished, and the challenge of building bridges between communities that had been taught to view each other as enemies. Do you think there will ever be real peace between whites and Apaches? Alice asked one evening as they watched the stars emerge in the desert sky. Dasan considered the question carefully before answering. Peace is not absence of conflict, he said finally. Peace is presence of understanding, respect, willingness to share same land without destroying what others hold sacred. Such peace is possible, but it requires good people on both sides to work toward it with patience and courage. People like us, Dasan confirmed with a gentle smile. And people like Ruth and Bell, like Ortega, and his miners, like the Apache families who welcomed you despite their own fears. Change happens one person at a time, one friendship at a time, one act of understanding at a time. Spring returned to the desert with exceptional beauty, as if nature itself was celebrating the peace that had finally come to the Arizona territory. Wildflowers carpeted the valleys in brilliant colors. The river ran full and clear, with mountain snowmelt and migrating birds filled the air with songs that spoke of renewal and hope. Alice marked her 13th birthday with a celebration that brought together everyone who had played a role in her survival and growth. Ruth prepared a feast that filled the boarding house's dining room, with the aromas of roasted turkey, fresh bread, and apple pie made from dried fruit that had been carefully hoarded through the winter months. Belle presented her with a deputy's badge, not a real commission, but a symbolic recognition of her courage and her role in bringing justice to the territory. Ortega and the miners had carved her name into a piece of copper ore that would serve as a permanent memorial to her bravery. The Apache families she had visited brought traditional gifts, beadwork carved animals, and a beautiful knife with a bone handle that had been crafted specifically for her hands. But the most meaningful gift came from Dasan himself. A leather-bound journal that he had been working on throughout the winter, filling its pages with Apache stories, traditional recipes, medicinal knowledge, and his own reflections on the events that had brought them together. "This is your inheritance," he explained, as Alice turned the pages with wonder and growing emotion. "Not money or land, but knowledge that has been passed down through generations of my people. Someday when I am no longer here to tell these stories, you will tell them to others who need to understand." Alice threw her arms around the old warrior's neck, tears streaming down her face as she realized the full significance of his gift. He was not just giving her a book, he was making her a keeper of Apache culture, a guardian of wisdom that might otherwise be lost as the old ways gave way to new realities. "I'll never let these stories die," she promised through her tears. "I'll teach them to my children, and they'll teach them to their children, and the wisdom will live forever." That evening, as the birthday celebration wound down and guests began making their way home under a canopy of stars, Alice and Dasan sat by the river as they had so many times before. But now their conversation was different, not the desperate planning of survivors, but the comfortable communion of family members who had found their place in the world. "Can I sleep here?" Alice asked, using the ritual words that had become their private code for safety and belonging. "You already are sleeping here, little rabbit," Dasan replied, giving the response that had become his promise of permanent love and protection. "This is your home, and it will always be your home, no matter how far your life's journey may take you." As they sat in comfortable silence, listening to the gentle sounds of the desert night and watching the moon's reflection dance on the moving water, both of them understood that they had found something precious and rare. A love that transcended all the artificial boundaries that divided people into categories of race, culture, and history. Alice had lost her original family to violence and betrayal, but she had gained something equally valuable. In return, the profound knowledge that family was not just about blood relationships, but about the bonds forged through shared struggle, mutual sacrifice, and unconditional acceptance. She would carry that knowledge with her for the rest of her life, and it would shape every decision she made about how to treat others and what kinds of communities she would help to build. Dasan had lost his wife and son to war, but he had found new purpose in nurturing and protecting Alice, in teaching her the wisdom of his people, and in helping her become a bridge between two worlds that desperately needed to learn from each other. His legacy would live on, not just in the stories he had preserved, but in the young woman he had helped to shape. Through his patient example of how to live with honor, even in the face of terrible loss. The desert wind whispered through the cottonwood leaves with the sound of ancient blessings carrying promises of seasons yet to come. And the eternal truth that love was stronger than hatred, hope more enduring than despair, and justice more powerful than all the forces of corruption and greed that sought to divide human beings from their common humanity. In the distance, a coyote called to its mate across the starlit silence, and somewhere among the rocks an owl hooted softly as it prepared for its nightly hunt. But in the cabin by the river, surrounded by the comfortable sounds of a world at peace, two souls who had found each other in the midst of chaos settled down to rest in the safety they had fought so hard to achieve. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to practice the lessons they had learned about courage and compassion, new chances to build the bridges that would make their vision of peace into a lasting reality. But tonight, they were simply a family chosen, rather than born forged by adversity, rather than easy circumstance, but no less real or loving for having been created through struggle and sacrifice. The stars wheeled overhead in their eternal patterns, marking time with the same steady rhythm that had governed the desert for countless centuries before human beings arrived to impose their small dramas upon the landscape. But beneath those ancient lights, in a simple cabin beside a quietly flowing river, love had triumphed over hatred, understanding had conquered ignorance, and hope had proven stronger than despair. It was enough. It was everything. It was the beginning of all the tomorrows yet to come.